Okay.
Get started.
Hey guys, so Team Forever Forward coming at you with podcast number 2. Thanks Steve Hall for coming back onto the podcast. Hopefully, fingers crossed, the quality's way better for this one, as our virginity of podcasting got popped. The quality wasn't that great. So Steve, for people that didn't listen to the first one, if you could just give us a little bit of an intro, please, man.
Yeah, sure, and no worries on the podcasting virginity and the quality. I've been there, learnt my lesson, and thankfully the podcasts are now slightly better than they were in the past. But
oh yeah.
So yeah, as who am I? I am the kind of owner of Revive Stronger, which is similar to yourselves, although we're not a completely online coaching company and kind of content creator. So we have the podcast. I post on Instagram regularly with kind of content and just try and disseminate good, valuable information to the audience. I myself am a coach full time and then do this alongside, and also a natural bodybuilder, and that's kind of where I put 100% of my effort and kind of training and nutrition all goes towards that. And apart from that, that's pretty much like 90% of my life, and then there's a small 10% that gets... At the moment, it's getting pushed on to like Love Island, and I'm going to get a load of hate for watching Love Island.
Are you watching it?
I do like a bit of trash TV.
See, I'm torn on the whole Love Island thing because I don't like the idea of the show, but the people that actually make the show are so good at their job that you just get drawn in by it and gripped, and it's like this. I'm addicted to this, but I don't actually like the TV show.
See, I like using the girlfriend as an excuse for why I watch it.
Yeah, same.
So I don't watch that rubbish. The girlfriend makes me watch it.
It's just on in the background.
Yeah. It's funny, last night I was actually trying to do a bit of reading at the same time, and I could just see myself like lowering the book every time as soon as it was on, and then the adverts come and you're like, okay.
Yeah, maybe I'm into this.
Yeah.
So today's talk is going to be mainly hypertrophy training based, and we're going to be talking about effective reps and sets for the majority of today's podcast.
So I think to start it off, Steve, if you could just give a bit of a background in terms of what this kind of effective reps theory is kind of suggesting. I know you did a post on it, I think today was it, or maybe yesterday, or a post up really recently, your latest one, about it. So if you could just give the guys a bit of a background going into it, what it is.
Yeah, sure. It's actually really coincidental that this was the topic, and I'd completely forgotten this was the topic, and I posted today the Instagram kind of infographic, and that is the theory of effective reps. And it is kind of basically the really short and simple answer is the closer that we edge towards failure, the more effective that rep becomes for hypertrophy. I like to further that a little bit and think about there are some reps that just aren't effective at all for hypertrophy. Like it's like going for a walk doesn't elicit any particular adaptations in the body. You have to take the body to a significant degree of kind of stress to create any sort of effective rep for hypertrophy. And at the moment, that seems to be like 3 or 4 reps in reserve, 3 or 4 reps away from failure. Seems to be if you take a set to that point, you're going to get some kind of hypertrophy adaptations going on. And that's not that all the reps before that were absolutely useless. It's just you need that degree of fatigue to really start stimulating hypertrophy. Kind of you have to take your body to a place it doesn't want to go, create a sort of stress so it has to adapt and respond. And then every rep from there onwards is slightly more effective for hypertrophy. You're switching on slightly more muscle fibers, and you're getting more kind of fatigue produced. And that's kind of the theory of effective reps, that kind of the reps closer to failure tend to be more effective for hypertrophy, and they're very stimulating of that.
Yeah, pretty spot on kind of summary of that. And I think I see it relating into the idea of why you would compare potentially the hard sets, and comparing those rep ranges to each other, provided of course they are matched on volume and also a relative intensity. So that kind of hard sets concept is something that has been talked about a lot, and I think Brian Miner's been on a lot of podcasts at the minute. He's been a busy man with all the podcasts that he's been on, but kind of rethinking the way we view a lot of different things. And I think something that I wanted to bring up and kind of ask about is about why you've potentially just this idea of the hard sets mainly, and I'm going to try and explain my question best as I can, because it's a question that I'm asking myself at the same time, so it's kind of just cool to more talk about and kind of nerd out more. And a lot of this is kind of more theoretical, because it's not something I practically necessarily do. However, the kind of thing that I'm looking at is why we potentially wouldn't train to failure in each set, given that we're saying that these reps are more effective, with the caveat, of course, being that the normal reason and response is the fact that that extra fatigue that comes with those reps is going to cause the basically the inability to produce more, or like be able to maintain that load you're using. But where I kind of am throwing this question is the fact that we're saying that for hypertrophy there's that kind of minimal threshold that is around that 30%, and we're saying that the sets need to be in between your minimum effective and max recoverable. So let's say that 15 sets is a good number for you. You can recover from it, all good. If you did all those sets to failure, obviously the load's going to drop, but is that an issue considering the fact that we're saying that that 30% threshold is still fine? So let's say that 100 kilos is 70% to start with. I take that to failure, and the next time I come around, it's lower because of that fatigue, but I still take those sets to failure. It's still above the 30%, and I continue doing that, and it's not dropping below that threshold, and I'm also not crossing any volume like kind of landmarks in terms of doing too much volume or not enough. I'm keeping the sets the main thing. I don't know where your thoughts are and why that might not play out, and if it made sense at all.
No, it made sense, and it is interesting to think about, because all of these things do interrelate to one another. As I kind of said in the post, it's kind of like, okay, every rep towards failure is kind of the closer to failure, the more effective they are. Why shouldn't we just train at failure all the time? It's because every single rep closer is more fatiguing. So if we do choose to fail frequently, then you're going to produce kind of exponential amounts of fatigue, but that could lead to load losses, so like you're talking about, and that down to like 30%, and then if those reps are taken towards failure, they're still effective as repetitions, as hard sets. I think in short term that would be okay. I think if you were to see a long-term study on this, the amount of fatigue that you'd get from taking everything to failure all the time would end up like you wouldn't be able to progress each week, and you just see knockoff from that, and you'd end up having to like deload too soon, and you'd maybe fall below the 30% threshold. Your volume would come so low that it would be no longer even kind of minimum effective volume. I think short term, I think for sure that could happen. I think long term, that's where the issues would start to like creep in, because of just all the fatigue produced due to all of the failure sets.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. It's kind of more of a theoretical, like, if you would, because
also just the psychological factor of having to train to failure every session would be pretty brutal.
Yeah, it's not, to make it clear to people listening, this isn't something I'd ever recommend doing, taking every set to failure, but it was more the thought process of, right, well, you're saying that we get the stimulus and we're saying that 30% we're still all good for growth. So why not do that with the caveat, like, you can just keep doing hard sets? But the things that I was coming up with as the reasons why you wouldn't, like you said, is that fatigue. Like, if we're saying that we need a deload to dissipate the fatigue, like, it's dissipating an amount, but it would need longer to lower it enough so you could reset it at a point to then progressively increase that time and time again. And I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of like whether or not that'd have a knock-on effect of potentially some of the signalling pathways, and also the injury risk and psychological, like you said, the psychological burden of coming in and being like, you've got to go to failure every single set.
I think what it really shows, and what's really cool about it, is that taking sets to failure as like an approach can actually be like a idiot's proof way of training effectively. If you do a decent amount of volume and you just go ham, like if you go really light, as long as it's not stupid light, then you can still produce hypertrophy. And I think this is why a lot of bros just end up getting pretty jacked, because probably they have good genetics, potentially on gear, and they just fucking train really hard, and that's causing a stress response. So it's just basically a really good indication that you can't go in the gym and just kind of continually like
Go through
pussy
the
out
motions.
of reps all the time and go through the motions. Exactly. You need to make things hard and harder, otherwise it's just not going to produce the great result. And I think in terms of practical application of doing that sort of training, I think that also provides a limitation in that it's probably hard to track progress over time, because you're just kind of like fatiguing yourself all the time. You're using maybe different loads, and that can be kind of a bit like difficult. And like you said, psychologically, the fatigue of going ham every single session, and that in itself, like you said, it's just going to create a drop in volume just because your intensity is so high, and that could potentially eventually lead you to a point where you're no longer doing enough volume because you're just creating so much fatigue you can't get there.
And also, if we talk, like another thing that's just popped into mind is adherence as well. So if we're saying adherence to a program, sticking to something over the longer time is one of the key things for anything, really. Because if you're not sticking to it, then there's pointless discussing any variable. But if that is so hard that someone stops training, then you're just,
it wasn't good.
your method's useless. That's one of the things I generally say to people as well when they look at gym bros and they're huge. Like, and you can't get away from the fact that they've got progress. Like, yes, they may be on things, but they've made some damn progress. And it's kind of like being more critical of like, right, there's all these boxes that we can tick for training in order to see growth. They've just ticked one that's probably a pretty important one for hypertrophy, and that's why. It's not because they're telling you that all these other things that they're taking, or like all their other training methods,
one magic trick.
Yeah, it's more the fact that they're just going nuts. And the question is like, could they not get better results if they tick the other boxes as well?
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think that kind of argument has been thrown at Mike Israetel before, and obviously he is on special sports supplements under his own kind of words.
I love that name, by the way.
Exactly, and he himself, I mean, he came up with the maximal recoverable volume, the volume landmarks, and he uses the reps in reserve. And to quote, well, not an exact quote, but he very rarely takes any sets to failure. He outrightly he doesn't, because he doesn't see the risk of going that far to like near to failure worth the reward, and he can get progress by going hard but not to that extreme point of absolute failure. And that's for me, someone who is of his nature, he knows the science, he's very practical, he likes kind of taking the anecdotes as well, and he is trying to get maximally jacked. He wants to become a freak. So if someone that smart with those sort of goals in mind uses such a technique, it kind of makes me realise that yes, okay, we need to train hard, but failure doesn't really seem to have that many benefits, and often maybe not worth the risk.
For the cost,
because the thing we kind of use a system is like a risk reward. We have like the kind of thing of two scaling factors of what is the recovery cost of this modality you're choosing and what's the benefit, and like a scale of 10 and 10. So like you have a 1 to 10 scale of recovery cost and a scale of 1 to 10 for the net benefit that it's going to give you. And let's just say like that leaving a few reps shy from failure, let's say like a 7 or 8 RPE, would give you a recovery cost of, I don't know, let's just say like around that kind of 5-6 mark, just for an example, and the benefit maybe be an 8. And let's say that if you go to failure, the benefit, let's say, is now a 9 or a 10, so you've only got 1 or 2 jumps, but now the recovery cost has come up to a 10. It's like that net difference, does that really swing in your favour? And or maybe could we just potentially use it at certain phases to get that little benefit out, where we've got the chance to dissipate that extra recovery cost for that net benefit? And I think that's where he kind of Mike goes for that kind of functional overreaching and just pushing for that last bit, I'd say.
100%. I love that.
The other thing that we're going to ask is, you mentioned it earlier, but the kind of tracking progress.
So like myo reps and things like that. How would you track progress with that sort of stuff?
Cool, yeah, this is...
I believe you said about it in another podcast that you use it, potentially, some of it. So just wondering how you go about monitoring it.
So yeah, it's really interesting because it's a question that gets thrown at me quite frequently, because people are a bit lost about how to track this sort of pump metabolite type of work, where it's like you're just going to, it's basically fatiguing the muscles to an extreme point, where you are using kind of generally lighter loads and you are going to close to failure, and acutely that's massively fatiguing, but because the weights are so low it's actually not chronically very fatiguing, and the body adapts to it very, very fast. It's kind of like LISS versus HIIT. that sort of scenario is like it's not that fatiguing long term. It doesn't take that much of a recovery hit because the loads are so low. But yeah, in terms of tracking it, it's something that I tend, because of the fact I use it towards the end of my hypertrophy macro cycle. So it's kind of like the last phase before they're probably potentially going to a mini cut, or potentially they're lowering volumes, whatever they're doing. So it's kind of like, right, we're using all the mechanical tension, we're using all the kind of muscle damage. Now we're using metabolic stress, trying to signal every single hypertrophy pathway, the kitchen sink of hypertrophy, I often call it, that sort of phase. And because it is layered on top of what is already hard training, so we've already got kind of that 8 to 15 repetition range, we're already doing all of that. This is like just something you add to the end of your workout to just, it's like a finisher kind of sort of deal. That's how I do it, just layer it on top. And so then week to week, I'm not too worried about tracking anything precisely. All I'm not making sure of is kind of, is volume going up or it's not coming down. So I kind of want the total amount of metabolites produced to go up week to week. So if you're doing like giant sets where you're trying to achieve maybe 40 total reps in as few sets as possible with like a leg extension in week 1, then week 2, maybe it's 45 reps, 50 reps week 3, 55 in the final week, keeping the load level and taking each of those kind of sets near to failure. And then you're just accumulating more metabolites. So that's the way I tend to do it, is I'm not too worried about tracking total loads or tonnages. It's just kind of the total amount of work done is increasing. And I'm not worried if like I don't need to increase loads. I'm just looking to like do more total work.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense.
Makes sense, yeah.
And we recently went to the Mac Nutrition James Krieger conference, and I had a chance to throw... Yeah. So I had off topic, but yeah, it was amazing. But I had a chance to ask him about the hypertrophy thing, because it is a question that was bugging me. And that's what he was kind of phrasing it as well. It's like, well, each time you do it, it's just you're naturally trying to push it, so you can just naturally add those few reps on here and then. It's kind of like not a long-term system. It's just that
you
thing
feel
there.
that you're doing more reps.
And I think that kind of, like when you're saying about how it's just a finisher and it's just these bits and we've still got the main meat of it, that's where people can sometimes lose focus. Like people like to pay attention to the different bits.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, oh, well, you're using this system. That doesn't mean that you're using it for every session, for every exercise, ever. It's like that black and white fallacy of like, there's a lot of grey area in between. Like, just because a method isn't like great for long-term, like for constant use, doesn't mean it's not applicable for something and at some times. Do you see any like populations or situations where the use of myo reps and things like this are, obviously you've talked about like the end of the macro cycle, but any other like clients maybe that you have that it's more useful for, like a better utility for, and potentially some clients that maybe like you would be like, okay, yes, it's a strategy, but I wouldn't recommend you personally would be using that?
So yeah, totally. And I actually loved your comments on kind of the black and white fallacy, because it's horrendous. It's just huge in the fitness industry. It's like supplements, exercise types, like all of it is so everyone thinks it's black and white, and it never is. And
no.
It's difficult because people post highlight reels. They like to post the metabolite pumpy sets. They like to post the food porn, whereas the rest of the diet's completely like clean as bros. So no, that's really difficult. But anyway, to answer your question, so in terms of where would I use this, maybe outside of the end of like a hypertrophy macro cycle, I think for people not applicable for, it tends to be not necessarily a type of person, but maybe their goals. So if they are more of a powerlifter, I do work with some powerlifters, it's probably not something they'd want to use too often, because it is more so typically hypertrophying the slower twitch muscle fibers, which aren't really very specific towards powerlifting, because they're not really going to be contributing to their 1 rep max by any means. So in those sort of scenarios, like it's just not really something they want to focus on too much. And then in terms of muscle groups, I think can be found like some people find, I for example, I don't know many people who do it well for hamstrings. I feel like whenever I try and do anything kind of pumpy for hamstrings, they just kind of like cramp up and just feel very awkward, like I'm gonna like just fall over and like die. Whereas like quads, even my lats, like lats, chest, triceps, they do really well with it, and most muscle groups do, but there's somewhere, just hamstrings is the main one for me, where I've just not seen it particularly be beneficial for people. Hamstrings tend to be more fast twitch as well, so they do better with generally lower repetition ranges, higher weights. That seems to be where it goes. And then in terms of using it in periods apart from like that last phase within a macro cycle of hypertrophy, maybe for people who are injured. So we've seen this with like occlusion training, so that can be like super light loads. You just kind of use a wrap to kind of occlude the upper body or the lower body, and that can be painful, but you can use really, really light weights and like super light weights and still get a hypertrophy stimulus, which is great. So that's really useful. And then for adherence is a big one. So some people they are those pump chasers, and it's kind of like, right, if you do this meat and potato work, you can do a little bit of pumpy work at the end. I wouldn't and I just kind of like gritting my teeth and say,
eat your cherry on the top of their program.
Yeah, so you can do it.
Eat your veggies, you can have dessert.
You can do it, but we're focusing on all this other stuff. Get as much as you can in at the end of the session for the kind of like pumpy stuff, and leave it there. But apart from that, that's really the only scenarios where I'm like, this is where I think it would be particularly not a good idea, and other scenarios where it would probably be quite a good idea. And then individuality is always there. So some people just find that they just grow really well from it. So maybe you would drop it in every other mesocycle for hypertrophy, because I find if you just chronically use it, it's like anything, it just becomes you become quite unresponsive to it. The body adapts to this sort of training quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean,
Nice.
Spot on with those ones. I'd probably, I mean, all of that points is pretty much bang on. I like the point about the injury side of things, because I think, again, super useful tool. When people get injured, it's like, no, I can't make any progress. It's like, well, yes, it's not going to be optimal because you gave up the search of optimal as soon as you got the injury, but at least we can do something in there.
People tend to focus on what they can't do as well when they're injured, when actually there is obviously stuff like that, the blood flow restriction stuff that they can do, occlusion.
Just another thought, maybe, what would you say about potentially people that tend to sandbag on their RPEs and say that they're at an 8 when they haven't even hit the scale yet, in terms of where they're at?
I guess, you could use it for that sort of thing. I think that'll probably be... I think it might throw them off a little bit because it's such different loading to what would be the heavier sets, so that could throw them off. But I could, it's definitely a good way to introduce them to like hard training, but using lighter loads.
I was thinking more of it being a potential like setback, like maybe not the best thing for someone like that if they're sandbagging it so much. Like if you're using a modality that requires the RPE to be at the top, if they're a character that doesn't go near there, it'd be okay. Like maybe you shouldn't, like, it might not be a tool for that. But again, like you say, maybe it's a good tool to actually get them to realise what the hell that feels like.
I mean, if they're going to sandbag these light weights, then there's no point. Yeah. But if they can go ham on these and learn how to go hard on the lighter weights, then hopefully that might translate to those other ones. But that it can be difficult for newer trainees. And I don't know, I don't often see people sandbag that much. Like, people who really want to grow, like, more so I see them going too hard than too soft, but that's just me.
That's another just random thought off of that then. If you're giving this to clients and they are going ham, do you tend to want like what exercise would you obviously program it in for? It's obviously not going to be deadlifts,
smile reps.
But if you're programming it in for someone, would you get them to send in video footage as well? Because if you're phrasing this as like, right, you've got to push it to failure, and they're already someone that's primed to go past failure when you don't tell them to go to failure, like, could you see some issues popping up with the breakdown of form, or just other factors just going in there that don't need to be there?
So, for these, I'm not normally too concerned about seeing kind of footage of these sort of reps. I mean, this sort of kind of techniques, because you are more so using lighter weights and you're doing it more so on safer exercises where going to near failure is actually quite safe. So normally I'm not concerned whether they're not going to do that, because I think for the most part when someone's told they need to go very close to failure, I don't know, I feel like if they're not going to go and do that, there's something wrong with them. They don't really want it enough. Like, if you've been told to go very close to failure on like a bicep curl and you're leaving like 10 reps in reserve or something, it's like, really, like, why are you even bothering with these more advanced like metabolite techniques? Just get back to normal lifting. So yeah, definitely don't want to be using this on big compound lifts. It can be pretty, it's just really not going to be worth even bothering about. You want to use it in very secure movements, so things like machines are great for these because you're kind of locked in, or isolation movements are great as well. You want to use your kind of big compound barbell lifts for the meat and potato mechanical tension more so work, and use these for other modalities that are much kind of easier to load up and be injury free, and where form isn't going to be compromised because of fatigue from like the lower back having to be in a particular position. Like a bent over row would be really difficult to use this for because you're just holding that position. You're just going to get very fatigued. I think when people try and implement it for those, they'd learn very quickly that it just isn't going to work.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of like looking at the exercise, what's going to be the most, like the
limiting factor.
Especially if it's a lightweight, what's going to be the fatiguing factor first. And if it's not that muscle group you're trying to stimulate, when you're using a modality that's trying to take that muscle group to failure and something else is failing before it, then is it that effective for it? So I've got to take my myo reps out of my deadlifts now.
Oh yeah, those deadlift sets to failure.
That's it. You mentioned something earlier as well that I wanted to touch on, in the kind of fibre type differences relating to the different rep ranges and such. Like, I know I've heard Mike talk about this, and when I say this, I know the kind of what he's going for behind it. But when he talks about, I think he was on, I believe it was your podcast with Eric Helms, talking about overload and saying that he would go through a mesocycle where it's more focused on the higher rep stuff to target the type 1, and then he's saying that the type 2 are readily available, ready to go on the next one. My question about that is, like, if we're assuming that these hard sets, or like the effective reps, we take it closer, is recruiting them and getting the same hypertrophy, can we assume that they aren't fatigued to be fresh? Like, I understand doing the different cycles, but how much would you, like, kind of any comments on that?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's slightly theoretical, I think, based. Like, we're not completely sure, kind of lower repetitions, more so hypertrophy, the type 2, and higher repetitions, more so hypertrophy, the type 1. And then when you are doing all effective repetitions, it's kind of like, well, aren't you then getting all of the higher kind of muscle fibers getting recruited? And off the top of my head, I can't think exactly. Mike, I know, has expressed opinions on why that is the case and whether or not you're actually okay. Actually, I think that now I've just thought about it. I think he said there's a difference of fatiguing a muscle fiber and recruiting it. So whilst you might recruit your faster twitch muscle fibers when you are going to these kind of high levels of fatigue, are they actually getting overloaded? Are they actually getting kind of utilized in a way that's going to create them to grow? He isn't so sure. So that, I think, is the difference. So when you are kind of using the higher repetitions whilst the kind of fast twitch muscle fibers are kicking in, are they actually getting fatigued to a point where they need to then hypertrophy? That's what he's not sure about. I think that is why, maybe that's the theory behind why higher repetitions aren't going to hypertrophy the fast twitch muscle fibers and vice versa, because they're not being kind of overloaded.
Difference between recruitment and stimulus, like stimulated. That's the thing. Like, I remember I drew up like some stuff for that, like theorizing about it, and it's important to point out, like, we are just kind of talking more about theories behind it, and it's not like hard proof for a lot of this stuff. And also, I guess the other thing to add to that is, if you're doing, we've just said you're not going to be doing sets to failure all the time, and if these low rep sets need to go to failure to recruit and stimulate the higher, like the faster twitch fibers, but we've just said that we're not going to be doing the sets to failure with everything, then you're already saying that you're cutting back that faster twitch thing, so gives more reason to potentially do a cycle with the faster twitch fibers in the next cycle, per se. If that makes sense.
I think a lot of the kind of undulation of repetitions is like what you said, in terms of it just is kind of utilizing something else, and so this is the benefit of like daily undulating periodization, where you are just changing something small and you're just kind of easing up recovery curves, you're fatiguing something else, so something else is recovering. So when you use this on like a mesocycle to mesocycle basis, you've kind of like just almost fatigued the hell out of that sort of repetition range, and you've eked out all the progress you can out of maybe that repetition range, and you can kind of eke out some more progress by entering a higher repetition range but you haven't been using quite yet. Again, it's all theoretical, and periodization for hypertrophy isn't necessarily even known to be even a set, like it's definitely not essential to whether or not it's beneficial. But I think the theory is the interesting part, because there isn't enough kind of science here yet to demonstrate whether or not these are definitely the way to go or not.
Yeah,
that's cool
for sure, 100%. I guess there's a few other bits that I kind of wanted to talk about, and I don't know how familiar you are with, like, I think Eric Helms talks about impulse a lot as like it relates to tension, in terms of like a magnitude and time of stressor. So he says like you say about the walking, like time under tension when you're walking is obviously going to be like the time is massive, but the magnitude is so low that it doesn't really get anywhere. So I think that it's again a bit of a theory, and I am kind of just putting in a tricky spot of me just throwing my questions at you as like to bounce off to see what your thoughts are. But he says obviously the fact that because impulse is kind of what's important, so that magnitude and time, and he says that in heavy rep sets, because your magnitude is higher, that kind of makes up for the lack of time, and for the higher rep sets you've got the lack of magnitude but the time kind of makes up for it. And he uses that as a kind of argument against slow kind of like time under tension reps. And this isn't something that I necessarily recommend doing, but my theoretical question would be like, if he's saying that the magnitude is lower and the time bit makes up for it, could you not take a weight, or like let's say you're going to do a set of 10 and you use 50 kilos for the set of 10, if I then do those 10 reps super slow, or like slower than usual, like exaggerated eccentrics and concentrics with 30 kilos, yes, the magnitude's down, but isn't the time component still like making up for that as if it was the same for a higher rep set but the same time course? So like those 10 reps are the same as 15 reps with a lighter load. Does that make sense? I don't know.
I think elements of it, you guys are frozen on my screen. I don't. Oh no, you're back. Okay.
You're back. Yeah, it froze for a second.
So I think elements of that for sure make a lot of sense. I think it's interesting, and I definitely agree with Eric in terms of kind of the like. That's why heavy load. Like if you just train meat and potatoes, mechanical tension all the time, and just go heavy, like you're making up for a lot because you don't need as much of it because it's just such a high stimulus. And then when you are doing the lighter stuff, you need to do more of it to kind of make up for the fact that, I mean, a lot of those repetitions that you're doing aren't really hard at all. So you need to do more of that to really get that efficacious dose response. And I think there becomes that sweet spot where you're doing kind of enough of the hard whilst producing enough volume to kind of give as much hypertrophy as possible. And then your question on kind of like the time under tension and the repetitions, I don't know, it's an interesting one. And I think if volume was matched, I think like it would produce generally the same results. Whenever you see something volume matched, the results are very much the same. I think it would just take so much more time to actually do that it probably isn't worth the benefit. And then I wonder if kind of the slow repetitions would create, I don't know, a disproportionate amount of fatigue, so you just couldn't do as much volume with them, and potentially get to a point where you were using loads that weren't of a great enough magnitude to produce hypertrophy. But it is interesting, and I don't think anyone would like to train that way.
No.
It comes back to that psychological factor of having to just grind through that. And
a lot of this is like, the reason I ask these questions as well is because it stems from, I try and challenge a lot of like my biases a lot of the time. So I know where my biases lie, and because I get that innate reaction when someone says to do a method. And I have always been fond of just the pure meat and potatoes, basic stuff, like, and the other bits to put in here and there, because I kind of phrase it as like, does this method cause results? Like, yes. Is it sustainable? No. Then just sprinkle it in as and when you need to.
It's like you said at the start with the training to failure stuff, or the myo rep stuff. you just put it in one thing as long as everything else is covered.
So that's where my biases were before, and then when this like effective reps and hard sets started coming out, it starts like questioning that in terms of like, the use of drop sets, like, you don't need the load, like, because my argument would be you need rest times to sustain the load, but then you're saying that all these other factors, so it's more stemming from like, I would recommend against that time and tension for the sake of maintaining the load. But it's kind of like me challenge that, and maybe I'm wrong about something.
I think
so. That's kind of where it's coming from.
I love that kind of idea of challenging your biases because it's really important. And we've got a podcast coming out with Brett Contreras soon where he does that a lot to himself, and he talks about kind of knowing your biases and kind of being very much knowing almost your enemy in terms of like what is your bias against like knowing their argument inside and out, so you can kind of challenge your own. And I think what we're identifying is that there's just so many ways you can achieve hypertrophy, and it's actually just finding a system that suits you and that you can use. And I think what you've landed upon is just a system that works really well for you. You can track it, you can make sure it works over the long term, whereas I think some of these, and this is my bias, these drop sets, using all of these methods all the time, they just become very hard to actually track and know that you're doing something right and progressing. That's my problem with those sort of methods.
And then the buy-in for the client to continue with that and to like show them, like, I think that's a huge component, is like, if you have the meat and potato stuff, you can see the numbers changing. And although that might not be essential, like Eric Helm saying like load progression isn't essential and all that kind of stuff, like I think theoretically it isn't, but kind of it is essential for client adherence, like,
you
and
said
that buy-in
at the start. If they don't stick to it, then what's the point of the whole process in the first place?
Yeah, for sure. Did you write down a question?
I was just going to say about some takeaways at the end from the podcast.
Well, I've got some more.
Yeah, I know. That's why I didn't start it yet.
Right, there's something else I was going to bring up. I guess it's kind of... that's what it was going to be. I didn't write it down. I remember it now. You talked about daily undulating periodization, so the use of like manipulating those lows. Do you see one being superior, one where you basically target the faster twitch and slower twitch fibers within a microcycle and mesocycle, so you're using different loads for that goal, versus a block where you just kind of, like you say, you're trying to hammer it in one go and the other? Do you see a difference, or is it more theoretical and more kind of like just leaving no stone unturned with that fiber before you go to the next one?
So I think it's definitely theoretical because of the fact we don't know that we're necessarily targeting different things. I think there becomes a problem. What I really like is the idea of kind of specificity, and even towards a specificity of like a hypertrophy rep range that you're attacking at a particular period of time. Because I don't know about you guys, but I definitely have in the past done kind of these routines, and they worked for me whilst I was like more novice intermediate, where I would have like strength days, hypertrophy days, and they just ended up butting heads after a while, where the hypertrophy would create so much fatigue, my strength was no longer good, and then because, the strength days would wreck me as well for my hypertrophy days, and they were just kind of like, you just weren't good enough at either. And I very much relate this to kind of like when you're at school, when you're not that smart, you can do like all the GCSEs, but then as you go to like A levels, you have to, when you want to get really smart at certain subjects, you have to specialize more, and you specialize more and more and more, where you go to like university, and then you get like a PhD, and you really, really specify because you don't have enough capacity to do everything at once. So this is very much like when you're trying to have strength days, hypertrophy days, and then if you actually specify, right, all my training is going towards the growth, that's what I want. And then if you try and, I think we can't separate the different hypertrophy pathways. It's not like when you're doing mechanical tension work, you're not getting any metabolic stress or any muscle damage. Like these are all happening at once. But I do think if you kind of transition between more so going for ones over others, I think you're probably going to see better adaptations. I just find if people try and attack kind of too far in terms of repetition ranges through the week, it can sometimes throw them off a little bit. You get very well practiced at using loads at similar rep ranges. And then if you use them all, then if you use everything at once, it's kind of like, where can you progress with things? And so I like kind of saving higher repetition rep ranges for later mesocycles, because then that allows, just because it's a higher repetition range, to do a little bit more volume potentially, because they just tend to be less fatiguing. So I don't think it's necessarily wrong if you were to like work through 6 to like 20 repetitions within one microcycle and have like metabolite work in there and myo reps and everything at once and just go with that. I just think that's probably going to be a shorter term strategy, whereas you could kind of separate it out into longer mesocycles and have more productive training that's going to be more stimulative of hypertrophy, because you're kind of like saving things for later. It's kind of like if you try and use too many exercises at once, it's kind of like you're doing every single chest exercise there is in the gym. It's like, well, now you're not really pushing any of them to like a great amount of fatigue. You're not adapting and like directing that adaptation very, very well. And so, and you've got nothing left then for future. It's kind of like pick one so you can then get really good at them. And then you see this as you get very advanced. You even want to specialize, like powerlifters specialize on like just the bench, or bodybuilders will specialize on like just leg training, and they keep everything else at maintenance. So I think it just makes sense as you get more advanced, and even when you're less advanced, you can benefit from just more of a specificity in terms of just what you're doing in the gym, and try not to do too much, but enough so that you've got kind of, you're hitting all your bases and allowing for like recovery adaptations and things like this.
For sure.
That's really cool.
Did you want to add anything on that? I just had one point.
No, I was just going to say about if you are trying to get good at everything, you can only progress and improve to a certain point, like you've just said. If you wanted to get really good at something, you've got to have a focus.
Yeah. I mean, we literally just came up with this like thing. I came up with it yesterday. I came up with it. It makes it sound like I created something. My mind like kind of comes up with ideas, and I have to scribble it down before it leaves my head. And it's kind of like,
as well.
I'm sure there's a graph for this, but I'm sure there's a name for this type of graph. Can you see that?
Spirograph?
Like a spiral thing. So like,
if
you had like a circle with a point, and like it's divided into sections, almost like a pie chart.
Right.
And each section was like something you're trying to get to.
Right.
And if we say you've got like a limited shading for an area, if you're trying to get all of those spirals, like each area shaded in, you wouldn't be able to progress out to it as much. Whereas if you dedicated all of it just to one path, you get way more out of it. Just a side note, kind of follows on for that.
Nice.
What was I going to add? Oh yeah, that was it. I think there's an extra layer to that, because I kind of agree with everything you're saying for that as well. But also, just going back to like the client level, because I always think about, it's all cool to theorize about things and talk about it, but always bring it back to the client level, because that's who you've got to deal with at the end of the day. If you are running out the situation, like you said, where you're doing everything at once and it's just constant, that kind of sounds to me like you're going to be on the same program or a very similar program for like a long period of time. And I'm not even on that, but it sounds boring. Versus an approach where you're going to be changing it. And let's say that they're equal. Like, the person that's kind of doing those blocks dedicated to other things is probably going to enjoy being sent like, okay, we're in a new block now, this is what we're doing for this. Kind of a focus, like a bit of a mental switch, maybe feeling a bit fresher mentally going into it, rather than it being like the same kind of stuff every time, like with slight variations.
Well, it's like if you're at the end of a massing phase, you sort of look forward to the cut, and like vice versa, if you're cutting, you're looking forward to the bulk. So is the way I see it. I always get that feeling.
Yeah.
No, I definitely see that, and that's where actually I think a lot of the benefits of periodizing for hypertrophy has become, because I can create kind of more excitement for clients, and they have like endpoints, and they know like it's not just you just run like a lean bulk and this program and you just keep going for as long as until you're a bit fat. It's kind of like they actually have a timeline almost where they know, okay, I'm going to do 3 months of hypertrophy and then we're doing something different. So I want to make sure I'm putting everything I can into make sure I'm hitting enough calories, I'm growing. I think people get a very like they go through the motions like you guys talked about before. You just get lackadaisical when you're just like, oh, I'm just doing this, I just need to eat enough to grow, like I'll just keep going. And it just becomes very easy to just go through the motions and not really push for progress.
I mean, straight away saying that, it's like almost with our weight loss clients why we put diet breaks in there. Like, I almost don't care if they do anything kind of from the physiology side, and they're unlikely to do something, but me telling a client you've just got to diet for 6 weeks, or like even 4 weeks, and you're going to get a break, like that's the time frame they have to concentrate on.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you've got to diet for 52 weeks. It's like, no thanks. Oh, 4 weeks, I can manage that. And we've seen it with kind of clients come on that the goal is weight loss. It's like where they've tried dieting before, it doesn't last like any longer than that 8 weeks. So that kind of, the fact that they're staying on it for like months and months of shows it. Or just we're really good con men and we keep them on.
The dietary adherence thing is like the number one
Yeah.
predictor of whether they're actually getting the result they're after or not.
Yeah.
So
And I think
even
sometimes,
if it does nothing, it's worth doing just because of the fact they adhere to it for a longer period of time.
100%.
yeah. And I think sometimes it can be left out in terms of like the hypertrophy talk and bodybuilders. And like, yes, the really like focused ones are likely to adhere to most things. But there is a huge percent of the population that this information goes out to that still want to get big, not like full time and like make a career out of it, but still want to make progress where adherence needs to be more of a consideration. For well, actually, even at the top level it does, but it's kind of more the physiology at that point.
I think that's possibly just because bodybuilders are typically way more driven people.
Yeah. Want to be aware of time wise, so I know you said that it was kind of the hour, so I mean that was the majority of the questions that we had. Guess if we do a little bit of a roundup like you've got.
Answering those. So I guess the takeaways I've written down about the training to failure was pretty much that theoretically it's pretty cool, but you wouldn't do it for managing fatigue reasons and like psychologically as well. And that you want that sort of one-trick pony thing of not focusing on the meat and veg of the programming and just going for there's this one magic trick to do. Also, I just thought, is there anything you would like to plug at the end? I know you've got the
Can we not bring this up though, because we can't go.
I know, I'm pretty emotional about it. That Jared Feather and Mike are coming over, so...
Yeah, have you guys got tickets, or are you going, or are you away?
No, we can't go. We can't go. Went last year, but couldn't go. That's what I mean.
He's on holiday, and I'm racing, so...
Oh, no.
Yeah, bad times.
Yeah, I mean, depending when this goes out, if it's going out pretty soon, then yeah, on the 14th and 15th of July, Jared Feather and Mike Usatella are here to go over, I mean, all the stuff like we talked about in miles of depth, which is going to be super exciting. We only have tickets left for the 14th, which is the single day seminar day. The VIP tickets sold immediately. So yeah, very excited to get them over again, and I'll actually be hanging out with them for a couple of days in London. I think I'm going to take them on like a open bus or something and get them on the top, and it'll be hilarious. They're like
sweet.
Cause the bus to like stop because they're too heavy.
Yeah.
Just off to the side.
The load requirement, maximum load. Going into a lift with them. Damn.
He's an absolute monster.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if you want to reschedule that so that we can, that'd be great.
Just completely reorganise it. Oh man.
Surely it's not that hard, right? They're not that in demand. Christ, I don't want to blow their head up too much.
Yeah.
Right, beautiful stuff. Well, thank you for that, Steve. It was good. Sorry if none of my questions made that much sense. They don't often make sense to me. So cheers for answering those. Good fun, and hopefully the quality of this one comes out a little bit better.
Fingers crossed this one is better than last.
No, absolutely. Thank you guys for having me on. Cool, I'll stop mine.